Don't Google your name. Why not? Because you might not like what you find. I was bored one day, so I decided to search my name on Google. I have a pretty rare name, so I wasn't expecting Google to give me a lot of results. Imagine my surprise when I came across a site that had my full name in the domain, www.myname.sot. Clicking on the link took me to a forum. I looked at the profile of the owner of the site and found that this person was the same age as me and had the same hobbies and interests. There were no posts on the forum, but I was intrigued and bookmarked it. About a month later, I went back to the site. This time it had more content on it. There were a few entries, like from a personal diary, mostly something like, "The weather was nice today," or "I'm so bored at work." Something like that. However, as time went on, I began to notice more and more coincidences with my life. The person lived in the same city as me. I found it rather odd that two people with the same rare names were living in the same city at the same time. At some point, I noticed that the content of the diary was very similar to my own life. One day, I went to a baseball game, and when I looked at the site in the evening, I found that the owner of the site had also gone to the same game. I didn't pay much attention to it at first. After all, there were tens of thousands of people in town cheering for the same baseball team. But then I began to think it was more than just a coincidence. Whenever I visited the site, I noticed small biographical details that seemed too much like me, making me feel uncomfortable. For example, the owner of the site mentioned his pet dog, and the name of that dog matched the name of a dog I had as a child. The author posted a picture of his car. It was the same model of car I drove when I was in college. He talked about eating at the same restaurant. It was the same restaurant I used to go to all the time when I worked at my old job. One day, when I checked out the forum, some chaps wrote a post to the author saying, "Happy birthday." That day was my birthday, too. That was the first time I decided to post something on the forum, just out of curiosity. I wanted to wish the owner a happy birthday and say that we have the same name. However, when I tried to write something, I realized there was nowhere to type a message. It wasn't a forum at all. It was just a static page. Weird, I thought to myself. In other words, the site owner had gone to great lengths to make it seem like it was an interactive forum, as if other people were writing on it, when, in fact, all the content seems to have been created by the owner himself. Why the fuck would anyone think of doing something like this? I wondered. I decided to send an email to the owner of the site. Here's what it looked like. "Hi. Believe it or not, you and I have the same name. Nice to meet you." It was just a friendly email. The next day, when I tried to look at the site, I found it was gone. It felt like it had just been deleted. Then I opened my inbox. There was one new incoming email, a reply to my email from yesterday. When I opened it, a chill ran down my spine. It said, "I found you. My brother hadn't left his room for 3 days. My parents wouldn't let me check on him. On the third night, when Jacob wouldn't come out of his room, I plucked up the courage to go to my mom. People don't sleep that long," I said. She was making a casserole, her 6th this week. We were already running out of room in the fridge, but she kept making more. I watched her, sitting in the corner of the kitchen, her posture twisted and her newly graying hair hanging over the food. I walked over and tugged on her sleeve, but Mom didn't react. She was spreading butter on the top crust. "Mom," I said, "can you hear me?" "He needs to build up his strength," she replied. "We shouldn't bother him." Before I could say anything else, Dad walked into the kitchen. His eyes were red and puffy, but he was smiling. He had 3 cans of Coke in his hands. "I'm starving," he said. I still have the taste of that awful cafeteria food in my mouth. "And I thought hospitals had good food, considering how much they make there," Mom said. "Yeah, sure," chuckled Dad and set the Coke on the countertop. Mom didn't want us to go into Jacob's room, but I was starting to worry. I looked out of the kitchen. His room was at the end of the hallway, and it looked like an abandoned lighthouse. The only sign of life was a New York Yankees poster taped to the door. There was a small gap between the door and the floor, through which you could see if the lights were on. The room was still dark, as it had been for the past 3 days. I turned to Mom again. "Maybe we should check it out after all," I asked. "I don't understand why places like Wendy's or Burger King don't open little cafeterias in hospitals," Dad continued. "After all, hundreds of people stick around there a lot of the time. I mean, it's a full-time business." "It's all politics," Mom said. "They sign these big contracts that are impossible to break." "Yes, indeed. That makes sense. It really does." Dad stood next to Mom, his face a few dozen centimeters away from the casserole. He took a deep breath. "Ah," he said. "It smells wonderful." "If you want, while the new casserole finishes baking in the oven, we'll make something from the leftovers," she asked. "I think we still have some left over from yesterday. The spinach and ricotta were delicious, don't you think?" "Very tasty. Very, very tasty," he said. I couldn't tear myself away from the food. "Jacob will eat too when he gets an appetite," Mom said. I turned around and took a step into the hallway. The space between me and his room felt long and narrow, like a stretched wire. When the smell of casserole was left behind, I smelled another odor. It reminded me of old gym socks. Even with my mom's set of candles and incense, I could still smell it. It wafted through everything. The last time I saw Jacob was when we were driving him home from treatment. His face was pale green and his eyes kept rolling. Mom told me to keep talking to him so he wouldn't drift off. I told him about my friends at school and how they were always teasing the teacher by putting buttons on her chair. It wasn't true. I'd just seen it once on a TV show, but I was just running out of stories to tell him. It didn't matter, though. Jacob didn't react anyway. He coughed. Pink drool dripped down his t-shirt. "Danny," Mom said, "why don't you warm up the leftovers? Let's all have a nice meal of spinach and ricotta casserole together now." "I can't stop thinking about her," Dad said. "I dreamed about her last night." I ignored my parents. I focused on my brother's door. I didn't dream about the casserole like Dad. Another dream kept me up at night. My brother would run into my room and flick me on the ear. It was a game we often played with him. We would tiptoe up to someone else's door and wait for our time. Then the attacker would run in and give me a good flick or two on the ear and run away. In my dream, Jacob would run into my room and punch me, but I didn't move. I just stood still. He would snap, laugh, then snap some more. Sometimes he would snap so hard that my ear would fly off. "Wake up, Danny," Dad said, snapping his fingers in front of my face. He stood in front of me, closing Jacob's door with him. "Would you mind warming up 4 servings of the casserole in case Jacob wants it? We'll eat it before the new casserole is cooked. I'd like Jacob to try it too, because I think it was one of your mom's best." I looked up and stared at him for a while. I couldn't tell what I was thinking, so I wanted Dad to feel it. Maybe if I stared at him for a long time, my feelings would transfer to him. But Dad only looked at me for a moment, and then looked away. In that brief moment, however, I saw something I didn't want to see. It was like looking into the tunnel of the world's deepest well. "Let's go," he said. He put an arm around my shoulders and turned me toward the kitchen. His voice grew more serious. "You'd better heat each piece individually, because if you put it on to heat all the pieces at once, you won't heat each one evenly, and you'll probably have a few too hot and a few too cold, and then Jacob won't feel the full enjoyment of how good these casseroles are." My father removed his arm from my shoulders and walked ahead of me, and I lingered in the hallway a moment longer. I turned to take one last look at my brother's door. I contemplated walking up to it and stepping inside, but I was afraid Mom would yell at me. I never really liked going in there. There was a vomit bucket next to his bed that always had pink slop in it, and there were always clumps of hair on the pillows. Even before my last visit to the hospital, my mom made me go in and talk to him, but I always made some excuse like I had a cold and didn't want to get him sick. When I couldn't get an excuse, I would stay there for a few minutes and watch him try to breathe. I'd tell him about some show I'd seen on TV and then run off to my room. I looked up. I felt like I was walking back to the kitchen, but I was moving toward the door. I didn't want to, but I kept moving as if my limbs were being controlled by a puppeteer. I put my hand on the doorknob, turned it, and opened the door. The smell of dirty gym socks filled my head like helium. Through the darkness, I could see my brother's face. The soft evening light was shining on him. His eyes were open and staring up at the ceiling. His arms were straight as a ruler, his fingers curled like a blooming rose. I walked over to his bed. Red saliva dripped from my brother's lips. James looked like a sullen clown. I flicked his ear. It was hard. I walked out and closed the door behind me. Walking back in, I realized I couldn't remember what his room looked like at all. Behind the closed door, he could have been doing anything. Doing burpees, reading comic books, preparing his next attack on my ear. Walking into the kitchen, I heated up 4 plates of spinach and ricotta casserole. When they were ready, I wrapped Jacob's plate in foil and put it in the oven to keep warm. After that, Mom, Dad, and I sat down at the table and ate in silence.